Welcome to the EI Guru podcast, a podcast completely focused on emotional intelligence. Typically, the first question I get is, what is emotional intelligence? In very simple terms, it's how we manage our emotions in our interactions with ourselves and others. Or put another way, it's being in the right state and not being in a state when under pressure. Emotional intelligence is another label for mindset, and we all know that when navigating those important conversations, we need to tap into our best. I'll be interviewing leaders and experts in this ever-expanding field and sharing the data on why emotional intelligence is the difference that makes the difference in all of our relationships. Remember to share and subscribe to the EI Guru podcast, and if you have any questions, you can post them once you've subscribed. So good morning and welcome to the latest episode of the EI Guru podcast. And I'm again joined by Dr. Jo Maddocks, and we've had a little bit of a break between unpacking the emotional intelligence model that Jo co-created back in the day, coming up to 30 years ago. And today, we're going to be looking at a number of the relationship management scales. So we've been looking at, and in fact, I'll get Jo is going to be better to recap what we've covered so far. So maybe if I just dive straight in and Jo, get you to recap where we've been so far through the model.
Yeah, sure. And people who've listened into the previous podcast, because we've sort of worked our way from the bottom upwards, haven't we? We started with the attitudes that underlie emotional intelligence, self-regard, regard for others, and how that manifests in our awareness of ourselves and other people. And then we spent a couple of podcasts talking through self-management, actually our behaviors, if you like, such as goal directedness, flexibility, locus of control, personal power. But of course, that comes across into relationships, and it largely influences how we interact with others. The arrows go, both ways, but I'd say it's more dominant from how we behave impacting others in particular, which is what we're going to look at a bit today. And when we talked about self-management, those facets, they relate very strongly to leadership and performance. So we picked up on quite a bit of that. And the importance of emotional intelligence generally, the recognition of it in society, in the workplace, in education over the last 20, 30 years, and the future of it. The likes of McKinsey Company and Harvard Business Review are still talking about 2030 being, a sort of growth period for this area, or more of consolidation and focus on where it's going. And particularly in areas like technology and artificial intelligence and so forth, does it need the human contribution? Of course it does. And this is where EI, empathy, human influence is vital, that we get it right. We talked about the emotional labor of jobs, the greater demand on people emotionally, mentally, perhaps less physically, but it's still in the body. And how that is very relevant to the need for emotional awareness and management of your state. And of course, the growth in well-being, understanding of well-being, mental health, mental illness and resilience, and that area we discussed is very relevant, of course. So there's a big, a movement which fits very well with what's been created over the last 20, 30 years in this field that fits for the future. And I think it's about not just talking about where it's come from, but how it's going to be appropriate to where things are going.
What blew me?
Yeah, sorry, Jim.
Sorry, just to interrupt, Jo. What blew me away really on when we were looking at the data was the well-being data. The $1 trillion productivity. The reduction in productivity because of stress, burnout, well-being. Is the sort of the title that it's being referred to nowadays, of course. And $1 trillion lost due to a decrease in productivity because of those individuals not their well-being, stress, etc. So EI has a massive impact. As you said, the data is very overwhelmingly in favor of improve your emotional intelligence, your ability to cope and deal with, and strategies to cope and deal with stress, and be able to recover and re-energize, all help people's well-being. And that's, it's sort of almost common sense. This is the funny thing, isn't it? Let's face it, it's common sense. And in a way, that's the old-fashioned term that we would have perhaps used, common sense. And we all know that common sense isn't common practice. So it's about trying to make sure that we are conscious and aware when we have those, the red mist hits us, and that we actually respond appropriately in certain situations. So I'm quite excited about our conversation today about navigating some of those tricky conversations that we might need to have with people that we work with, but also relationships in general. So when we're talking about relationships, we're talking about our personal relationships, but also our work relationships as well. So sorry to interrupt, but I just
it's absolutely, Jim. I mean, I like the phrase of common sense isn't the same as common practice. Because this is what we've been saying in some of our earlier podcasts about the neuroscience behind emotional intelligence. We know what we should do very often. The hard part is putting it into practice in a continuous way. You might be able to encourage somebody to do it for a moment, but how do you make that habitual and ingrained? Takes a lot of rehearsal. And we know the emotional brain learns through experiential activity. The cognitive brain, I know, I always say, and I know a lot about emotional intelligence, but I don't pretend I am the most emotionally intelligent person.
Me neither.
But we do say between the two of us, we probably just about make a decent human being.
I reckon you're bang on. I think that's so true. So true.
And this is why it's so important with emotional intelligence that we don't just intellectually know it, we embody it, we practice it, and we know how to make that happen, because this is what well-being is. Everyone's read self-help books, and you can go online and get the 10 top tips, and you probably, most of the therapists and coaches out there, the people who have got the most issues, because they're so interested and they've read so much and they're so learned about it. But EI doesn't work that way. EI works emotionally, not cognitively. And therefore, even us talking about it's a great starting point, but it's what you do afterwards. And I was struck by this, your previous podcaster, Paul, talk about experience. He'd been literally in the trenches doing this stuff, and he knew how it affected him with PTSD. But he went out and what did he do? Walk 5,000 miles around Britain. Crazy things.
Ran, not walked.
Ran. Sorry,
ran.
I mean, phenomenal.
Incredible.
And actually, that's doing something, isn't it? That is doing something.
And interestingly, I have seen his transformation as well, Joe, which is quite impressive to see someone. I didn't realize just what sort of state Paul was in when I first met him. He'd literally come back from a tour. He was being discharged medically for PTSD, and he was on the edge. 8 of his friends in the last 6 or so months have committed suicide. And, one of the reasons that he and his colleagues that have, got together and started, creating this new charity called Head Up, the reason for that is that, enough's enough. So as you probably heard in the podcast, the army, the forces train people really, get them in a great space to then be able to go to war. But actually, when they come back, they're still struggling to get that aspect right. How do you, sort of reintroduce people back into the real world, And
that is the ultimate end point of it, of not getting this right, is, end of life. Suicidal. And I know you've done more on that side of things with your charity work with the Cycle for Suicide.
Cycle Against Suicide.
So this stuff, it's not just about performance, which is obviously we're focused more on the workplace, but the work is a large part of what we do, and it provides an awful lot of our self-esteem and worth as a person if we feel productive, engaged in what we're doing, and choosing the right career path. We were talking just before this about the importance of young people finding the right path, because that's going to be the world you're going to spend a lot of your time in. It's going to mold you and your well-being. And I was just going to finish really by saying, on the recap bit, is that we talked about the evidence for emotional intelligence. It does come across all those tiers, at the performance level, in terms of predicting job work performance, there's wealth of evidence there. The middle level about engagement and awareness, there's the stacks of evidence of climate change, people being more engaged and more productive, with the encouragement of emotional awareness and of others. And finally, the well-being bit, which we've just been talking about, self-esteem, which is where it all stems from, of course. But it's not always easy to address that. So hence with the emotional intelligence profile and other tools, we look at the different facets as ways in to get to the core of the onion, to find one piece that might be just the piece in the jigsaw that you're missing that will really help you. And that's why we go into these different parts of the jigsaw, as we're doing today. So yeah, we're going to talk about relationship management today, Jim. I was going to talk a bit about this interesting relationship management, because it's a lot of the scales are what we call dynamic, so they're sort of movable. More is not always better, and some of those gets into defensive behaviors, dark side, derailment kind of characteristics.
Yeah,
which is also very, very powerful understanding. The deeper levels of what drives us very often, sometimes to perform very well, but also to take us off track and not achieve what we want, and to generally also impact negatively on other people.
So I mean, just as we start unpacking and looking at the relationship management scales, for those people that may have had an EI profile done, they've done the questionnaire. And for those practitioners out there that use the profile tool, so the relationship scales are measured differently. So maybe if you can speak a little bit about that. I don't know whether you were going to or not, Joe, but I always find it interesting. You just alluded to the fact that you can have aspects of too much or too little. So maybe if you can
I'll start there.
Yeah.
And this is one of the most interesting things for me, and it differentiates the model that I sort of got into originally with Tim Sparrow. About emotional intelligence for me is not, although it can be measured as a trait, and there are tools that do that, for me it is a dynamic concept. Emotions are variable, they're reactive, and our behavior as a consequence will change. Aristotle talked about the virtue of being moderate, of not being at the extremes, and I think this is a good general starting point. Is you can have too much or too little on many facets. In fact, pretty much all aspects. If you take it to the extreme, you can overdo it or underdo it, and learning to find that sort of appropriate balance, or maybe learning to be able to move across the scale appropriately. So sometimes we do need to be pretty assertive or even aggressive, possibly. There's a reason for aggression. It's a useful attribute, as long as, was it Aristotle who also said it's learning to when and how and who to be aggressive with and all that. It's not just letting it control you. So yeah, I think this is what we do certainly with the emotional intelligence profile instrument, was about getting that balance right. There's an optimal level, and a good example of that is how, in terms of dynamic variation, is that you can actually go from one end of the scale to another very quickly. There's a facet we call emotional expression and control. And at one end of the scale, you've got bottling things up, over-controlled. And the other end of the scale, you've got letting things out, being highly volatile, unpredictable. And you can tell what happens if somebody bottles things up, keeps it constrained. It's not going to just stay there. It's going to come out in one way or another, often in maladaptive type of behaviors. So, I remember Tim Sparrow, who's a psychotherapist, my colleague and co-developer of some of this material and the models, said with his patients, they'd come to him and say, I've got this anger problem, I need to be able to deal with it and control it. And he says, well, actually what you need to do is let it out.
Yes.
Learn to notice it sooner. pick up on the early signals of irritation and frustration, or being too passive, whatever. And then it'll be easier, because once you get the red mist or it gets too strong, it's really tough to control.
Yeah, I call that, and I think we've laughed about this before. I
Mm,
label it as having a hissy fit. So,
mm,
having
mm,
a hissy fit,
mm,
like you've lost control of yourself, and
mm,
yeah, I think about a child in a supermarket. Like the 5-year-old that's not
mm,
getting not
mm,
getting their way.
mm,
They want a sweet or something before
mm,
lunch, and the
mm.
parents said no, and they throw themselves on the ground and flap about. We've probably all experienced that as parents.
Yeah.
And that is a little bit of a hissy fit, and I call them
Mm,
either a big hissy fit or a mini
mm.
hissy fit. So
Throwing your toys out the pram.
absolutely, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Which is actually quite an interesting analogy, hissy fit, because you're really often going back to your child self. It's that part of you that
yeah,
overreacts and is spontaneous and fun, but also troublesome and difficult. Um, and when that takes over, it's difficult to sort of control ourselves. So yeah, there is this rebound effect. So the same person who bottles this emotions up can also be quite unpredictable and volatile. And finding the middle ground, if you like, in TA, transactional analysis, it's about using your adult, the part that's choiceful and aware, that's
yeah,
got a sort of kind of problem solving intelligence. So hang on a minute, just let myself go. Nothing wrong with being very parental and organized and control of my emotions at the right time, like what we're doing now, because we're
yeah.
business people and we're doing a podcast. But other times I'm going to, like tonight, I'll go to a party, let my hair down, whatever. But that's choiceful behavior. Yeah, it's not
You
sort of
you
crazy,
can
unpredictable.
you can let your hair down.
I just had my hair cut, Jim.
Yeah, well, there you go.
You can let your you
My
know
beard go. Yeah,
yeah, Movember beard. Is
yeah, it's
that what
gone
it
now.
is?
Well, November has gone now, so I
Yeah,
did end up with
got
some
it.
sort of cowboy without that bit in the middle. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah.
it's been trimmed back now.
Okay. So yeah, we're talking about the dynamic aspect to many of the areas of emotional intelligence, and the example there was emotional expression and control. But we can pick up on the other scales we'll talk about later, and the similar variation goes on. And I was going to link that to the life positions.
Yep.
I'm okay, you're okay. The underlying self-regard, regard for others.
Mm-hmm.
Because depending on our self attitude, if I've got a low self-regard or low regard for other people, that's going to come out in these scales.
Yes.
Yeah, on the attitude 2x2 matrix.
Yep.
So if I've got a sort of and this will vary depending on situations. We can be thrown back into feeling bad about ourselves or feeling very critical about other people. But starting with the example of low self-regard, I'm not okay, and also if you back that up with other people that are better than me, so
Yes.
you put you on a pedestal and me down here.
Mm.
How does that come out in different parts of emotional intelligence? Well, if you're to take the example of I don't know, emotional expression and control, the one we've just talked about, you may tend to keep all your emotions in and think nobody wants to hear what I've got to say. Although sometimes it can come out the other way,
Mm-hmm.
and you can become a stroppy and say, be so upset and just let your emotions out. But some of the classic ones are, so low self-regard, you'd have low self-awareness, not paying attention to your own needs and what you want.
Yep.
Maybe low goal directedness, which is what I matter doesn't really count. Other people come first. And I'm not going to follow my own needs and wants because I've got to please others, that type of thing. And on some of the rebound scales, like trust, you may become over trusting of other people. Think
Yeah.
they're more intelligent, more capable, more worthy,
Mm-hmm.
and depend on them. So that would take us to the other scale of interdependence, being dependent on other people.
Yeah, for their view, their opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So you
Because
find,
the
yeah, sorry.
self-regard pushes, so you're
Mm,
self-deprecating in that space. So
mm, mm,
you're not comfortable in your own skin.
mm, mm,
So your internal dialogue's not great,
mm,
which then triggers off the thought that everyone else is better than me,
mm,
compared to me. so my view is not going to be accepted, and then they start seeing those behaviors as well. So they then look for, for confirmation of, misreading body language. So their self-awareness and awareness of others may also not be particularly great.
Yeah, because we distort our self-perception through this lens of I'm not okay. So we may say, oh God, I didn't say the right thing, or what are people thinking of me now? It's continually being reflected in this self-concept of low self-regard. And do bear in mind, we move around those positions. So it doesn't mean you live there, even though they're called life positions. We may have a core default position, but yeah, the question we often ask is, how do you get yourself back in the good zone, where you do feel okay? And you have equal standing for yourself and others. So you don't want to lose your regard for others, but not use it as a reason for putting yourself down, which is often we do. We compare ourselves as well. They're more friendly. They've got more friends. They're doing better than me, or whatever it is. All it does is reinforce of lowering ourselves.
Yeah. And that also speaks to the emotional resilience and also the personal power aspects of, going back into the self scales. So as you said, it's very dynamic. And typically when I see, and you will have seen this as well, when someone does score low on their self-regard, that those two first scales of the self-management scales get hit quite badly, typically.
Yes. Absolutely, because they're highly correlated with self-regard. I suppose I was focusing on the relationship management because they're the ones, but it affects all the different parts.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And the other side, of course, is the other side to that. So would be the high self-regard but low regard for other people.
Yes.
So the masking, not feeling, it's actually underneath that as a sense of I'm not okay. But the way you protect yourself is by pointing the finger at everyone else and saying they've got the problem. So it comes out as low regard for others. So in relation, how's that relevant to relationship management? Well, if you look at those scales, such as trust, instead of being over trusting of other people, which is the low self-regard, you'd be mistrusting of other people. Almost suspicious, doubting their capability, questioning what they can do. Another scale, of course, is conflict handling. If you're coming from what we call the critic position, I'm okay, it's you that's got the problem, you're going to probably come across as quite aggressive.
So you dig your heels in with your view, your perception of stuff, and fight that corner.
And you can look at all these what we call multi-scales or rebound scales, the ones that have too much and too little. You'll find if you're in the critic position, one side of that tends to come out. It's one side of the red zone. So you'd be over dependent on others, over optimistic about what you can do, over aggressive, emotionally under control, possibly mistrusting. So all those kind of things. And it comes also out in the self-management scales, because you'd probably be low on flexibility if you're critical of others. Why should I fit in with you? Why would I be aware of you? Why should I even pay attention to your needs? So and on the other side, of course, is low self-regard. The submissive position, as it's called, is quite the opposite. Over trusting, dependent, passive, not putting your own needs forward, and so forth. And that's why these two positions are so important when we understand rigid defensive behaviors around self-management and relationship management.
So people knee-jerk to their natural response because it is linked quite solidly in their life positions. And that's the way they run. So they're used to running that pattern of behavior.
And they are comfort zones as well, because remember, defenses are there to protect us temporarily, at least. They make us feel better about ourselves. They take us away from the fear and the pain that we had. Maybe I'm not good enough, or people aren't going to like me, or I'm going to be humiliated. Whatever underlying reason, that's why these behaviours, why they come out. In the 16 different areas of emotional intelligence.
And it's interesting that the self-regard piece I know we've spoken about all this already, Joe, but it is fundamentally the most critical piece of the equation. It's sort of like the
Yeah,
most important. So someone that scores pretty low on their self-regard, in my experience as a coach, they can be the tricky ones to get them to shift their self-regard, and grow it,
yeah,
because it,
yeah.
it takes effort, and they have to start feeling better about themselves to give themselves time,
Mm,
to develop themselves,
mm.
so they believe everyone else is more important, so they don't. So it is a vicious cycle,
It
and they.
is, and it gets reinforced very often when people complete a questionnaire. So somebody with low self-regard is going to underrate themselves by definition. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So the definition is they've scored themselves a 2 when really they're a 5 or more,
Mm-hmm.
but they always see themselves as less worthy, less okay.
Yes.
And so it's worth reinforcing. If you start from that position, then you are underrating yourself.
Yep.
Compared to, and you're also comparing yourself often with a norm group of many people who overrate themselves.
Yeah.
Now, overall, those people probably balance each other out. But if you're in the underrating self, then the chances are you should give yourself a couple more points.
Yep.
Um, depending on your interpretation and where it goes in a coaching session. But all it does is you look through, oh, I've got low self-regard. Well, that's reinforced by looking at my personal power, my emotional resilience, flexibility. They're all low as well. So clearly, I have got low self-regard.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
And it is something that I create the awareness uh, for the individual that might score low on self-regard, is that actually, yes, that will then have an impact on the rest of
Mm,
the way you've scored all
mm,
the other scales across the report. So it's about the conversation that we can have, as
mm,
opposed to
mm,
here's your score. Don't get fixated on the score. This is movable, and
mhm,
and as you've said, it can change throughout the day. The
mm.
life positions, as you've said, also are a little bit more fixed, so they're your default, so you perhaps go back to those.
Yeah, yeah.
But I have seen people shift their, actually, I know
Mm,
and have seen people shift their scores significantly,
mm,
once they've had
mm.
the awareness, and once they've started doing things differently, so thinking differently,
Yeah,
behaving differently,
yeah.
getting different outcomes.
Absolutely. And it can be quite quick sometimes. It
Yep.
it can actually be a choice. Do you choose to have low? I know it sounds, but almost self-awareness is you're born okay. You're born a worthwhile human being. You are an okay, worthwhile being. You just don't realize it yet.
Yes. Yeah.
That's an assumption, but nobody knows. We'll just say it. Well, try it out. Just start with that assumption that maybe you're okay. Live with it for an hour or two, or even a day, and see
Mm.
if it's more useful to take that belief and adopt that belief. It
Yeah.
may be untrue, but then again, the one you have about yourself may also be untrue. We don't know scientifically what the truth is, but if it works for you, try it out a bit more often. Yeah.
Yeah.
Try
No,
using holding on to that long for longer.
I think that's a beautiful. I typically talk about, is it helpful or is it
Yeah.
hindering?
Yeah.
Is it hindering you or helping you?
Yeah.
And I quite like that approach of, okay, so try it on and
Yeah.
see if it
Yeah.
fits. Sort
Yeah.
of put the glove on. Does it fit? Is it
Yeah.
comfortable?
Yeah.
And if it's not comfortable, give it a whirl
Uh,
anyway, because actually you might get different
mm.
results as a result of trying a different approach to the whole thing.
And it brings up the question of why have we chosen, assuming we've kind of chosen this unconsciously very often at a time in our life, maybe when life was going badly, we were being bullied or things didn't work out. Why would you have chosen low self-regard? Why did you have chosen to be not okay?
Mm,
Um, Now, again, try it out. I'm not saying I know this, but w would there be any reason for it? Our brains are quite logical. Well, they are really. There's a payoff for it. Yeah. So the reason I criticize myself or put myself down or don't take the front position and say I'm, not good enough, whatever it might be, at the time you started doing that, maybe at school you didn't get picked out for having to recite something because it was very embarrassing standing up in class,
yeah.
or you didn't want to be a leader because people might, laugh at you, or you didn't put yourself forward for being, the um, going to parties or meeting people because you didn't want to be rejected. There's often a reason we may not be aware of that throughout our life is kind of reinforced. So I've sort of chosen to avoid, for example, if
Yeah.
it's that's that submissive position we were talking about. Um, and maybe it's helped me avoid those awkward or difficult or risky situations. But now is a time in your life to try something different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
works equally for the other side, of course, the person who's coming from the critic position. I'm okay, you've got the problem. All right. So those are equally just the same defense manifesting differently. So underneath it is, I'm not okay. I fear some kind of rejection by other people. I fear humiliation and not being good enough. So what I do is I become the chief executive, or I become, the most capable expert, or I put everyone else down to make sure I don't have to listen to anybody else.
Yeah.
But either way, what these rigid, critical, defensive behaviors are doing is avoiding me having to get in touch with my own stuff. And they are, of course, toxic. And as Aristotle says, it's fine. The virtue is find the balance between the extremes of these behaviors, which takes us back to relationship management, which is why the middle point in these scales is what we're trying to attain in terms of emotional intelligence.
Yeah. So I like the red and the green way it's scored as well, because actually what you're looking for is less red, more green. So, sort of dampening down the red scores. If you've scored high on the reds, then that's it's almost like a visual representation of, okay, I'm crazy mistrusting. I need to dampen that down. I need to be more carefully trusting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because actually, interestingly, those scales, when I'm coaching someone and they are mistrusting, that leads them to not then delegate more effortlessly with people. So they mistrust, which means they will then do the task themselves because no one can do it as well as I can. And then they don't coach and don't develop that individual, and the individual gets stuck not being able to take on some more responsibility. So it's an interesting pattern that runs out. And then, of course, if you get the leader that's over trusting, they'll give stuff to their team members, and they're not capable because they're just over trusting them, without any real evidence to say, actually, I know that you've got the experience to do this, and and check in with them. They just chuck it at them, and then they come back with not the wrong result that the leader wants.
Yeah, I mean, trust is a great example, isn't it, of people getting it, trying to find that balance between the two ends of the pole. And people will, and this is gives a good example again of people aren't just at one end or the other. They often rebound from one, because what happens when people over trust people?
They get stitched up because the task doesn't get done. So then they mistrust.
Yeah, once bitten, twice shy.
Exactly.
This is the inevitability almost of overplaying one side. And why do I overtrust people? Because I like to be a nice person. I'm a coach. We do our kind of thing. And I often say with trust, we find a lot of people in our line of work, the helping professions particularly, are over trusting.
Oh yeah,
but at a cost.
Yeah.
At a cost.
No, I'm definitely over trusting. Well, you've seen my scales, Joe.
Yeah.
I'm a 10 on over trusting. It's sort of like that stitched me up a number of times, in a professional context and also personal context as well. So yeah.
But there is a way out of it, and of course, being aware of it first of all. And again, self-regard, recognizing actually your interests matter. And I think as a coach, you'll recognize, that the point of coaching people is not just to be their mate.
Exactly.
It's nice if they like you. It's nice, but you want respect. You want to be coached with somebody who's prepared to challenge you, but always have your interests at heart. Unconditional regard for you is how Carl Rogers described it. As for the therapist, it's unconditional regard for their patient. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to be saying everything they want them to say or agreeing with everything, but as long as that comes across, and I know fundamentally Jim wants the best for me, then I'm prepared for you to challenge me, not agree with everything I have to say, even come across as mistrusting if it's appropriate. and it's a tough thing to do, because often if mistrusting is coming across because you are low regard for others, then it's maladaptive. Yeah. But if it's coming across alongside high regard for others, you care about the other person, you have compassion for them, then that mistrust is quite acceptable. You're just checking things out. You're questioning your assumptions about somebody. You're listening to your intuition. Does this hang together?
Yeah.
And if it does, great, move on.
I like that term. Actually, I've not heard you talk about unconditional regard before, because of course we're conscious of unconditional love, but unconditional regard puts a more professional slant on it, which is I'm coming from my intention is to support and help you grow, and I quite like that.
Yeah, I talk about it in the paper I wrote on an attitude-based model of emotional intelligence, and that's where this whole theory comes from. I can give you the link. It's a free download journal paper, Frontiers paper, an attitude-based journal model of emotional intelligence, of course, differing from a personality-based model or an ability-based model of emotional intelligence. And that's where we're talking about unconditional positive regard, which is a concept Carl Rogers, defined, has been evolved over the last 40, 50, 60 years, really. And is represented by this approach we've taken as well. Not just unconditional positive regard for others, but unconditional positive regard towards yourself, of course.
Yeah.
And if you unpack each of those words, they're each very important.
It speaks to the whole concept of the awareness model, awareness of my intention. So I'm aware of my intention when I'm speaking with you, but I'm not actually sure how it's landing with you. So the conversation we're having, I'm not sure. So the only way we can clarify all those things is to ask, and check. So, all that stuff gets missed in communication, personally and also professionally. And we go around the roundabout, thinking, oh, I should have said that, or what did they mean by what they said, and that's where a lot of, we were talking earlier about the conflict stuff. That's where a lot of the conflict issues come up, is misinterpreting the person's intention.
And not wanting to offend people, I presume, certainly in the British culture, I believe, is that we have certain protocols and ways of communicating, things you do and don't say.
Slip upper lip comes to mind as soon as you say that,
or not offending people. Tread on eggshells is the phrase, but all of this can lead to miscommunication, and that kind of avoidance, which also creates later, these things don't go away, they sort of fester and grow into bigger escalate. They can become unresolved issues.
People tend to sort of catalog. I mean, I'm not particularly great at memorizing stuff. That I tend to let stuff go typically. So I can't seem to catalog stuff. If I'm in an argument, I say, yeah, but the other week, Joe, you said this or that, and and blah blah blah. Sort of like,
that's probably what makes you such an easy person to be with, Jim, because you're not what they used to call them, stamp collecting. You're not looking to hold grudges against people, and you kind of forgotten about the bad stuff. Well, hopefully.
Typically I play that way. I mean, I suppose I will come across situations where I think, oh, okay, just to have a bit of a poke, you might say something that you do recall, but I typically don't hang on to that stuff, that, because it doesn't really serve you.
No. So I suppose we've been talking indirectly about trust, and
yes,
I think we've mentioned quite a lot about it. It is the first scale on the relationship management ones that demonstrates too much and too little, from mistrust to overtrust.
And trust is such a critical aspect of any relationship, whether it's an intimate relationship or a professional one. And Lencioni's model, which you're familiar with, that the foundation level of his 5 levels of dysfunction, the first level is trust. And talking about trust, a simple exercise for a leader or someone to think about is if you're even in a personal relationship, it might be useful for someone to think about their relationship, and if they have got trust issues, write down some of the things that are destroying trust. So what sort of things is my partner doing that's destroying trust with us, and what sort of things could they be doing to improve trust, to build trust. So typically if I've got a leadership team together, and I know you've done similar exercises as well, where you get split the team in half. One group will work on what are the things that is destroying trust within our team at the moment. What sort of behaviors are being displayed, exhibited, played out that is destroying trust, and then the other group work on what are the things that we can be doing to build trust, and then they swap around and add to the list, etc. But it's a really, really powerful exercise to do, and creates, and what we're talking about is obviously creating more awareness around how to navigate towards a better place called trust.
And is there a common theme of what undermines trust and what builds trust?
There's some typical sneaky, conniving behaviors. So in the room, we're all sat there saying, yes, we agree with this is what we're going to go and do. And then so the thing that immediately destroys trust is the corridor conversations post the meeting that says, what an idiot, what are they thinking, there's no way I'm going to be doing that, or they agree, and one of the leaders in that team will then go off to his team and say, there's no way we're going to they've agreed this, but we're not going to do this. So those sort of things.
Reminds me of that cartoon, Jim, where the chief executive is presenting to everybody around the board table, and they're all doing what you're doing now, nodding
exactly
in agreement, and then you've got bubbles in their head saying,
I love that.
Forbid.
I love that.
Can't wait to get out of this room. What are they on about?
I'll share that because I think it's such a power. I still use that slide, actually. I think pigs might fly is one of the bubbles, and there's no way,
no way.
And
they're all going like this.
Exactly. For sure. Completely agree, idiot.
I mean, some of the workshops we've done before, Jim, are around improving openness in groups. Which is a very threatening thing for many people. So, wait, how open do you want me to be?
Of course. And that's the challenge, isn't it? So trust gets eroded when if you chip in, if you are being vulnerable and trying to be open, when the boss then doinks you on the head for that, or everyone looks at you in the room and says, what? So
we often talk about going beyond blame as a level of openness, because I think sometimes if you really want me to tell you what I think, I'll tell you what I think. And it's an offloading of sort of, you did this, you did that, and we talk about, okay, we'll take it further. So how do you feel? Well, that makes me feel very upset and angry. You make me feel like I'm no good at my job. And that's a different level of truth. I feel upset and angry. Okay, let's talk about these are the feelings, and what are your fears? What underneath that, maybe if it's something about me, I start thinking maybe I do feel I'm not good enough, or I worry that's or I worry that I can't get on with you, and we can't build a relationship here. Now we're getting to a different level of conversation that we can actually start trying to resolve things. But if you don't get beyond that sort of name calling, blaming level of openness, then it is difficult. And that's sort of the red zone in the sandwich, if you like. That if you can't get beyond it, it is going to create conflict, and that's what people try to avoid. So they stay on this superficial level of largely pretending, avoidance, distortion, whatever it is, and often passive aggressive behavior. So I might not tell you, but I won't do it, or I'll do it badly, or I'll tell all my colleagues not to help you. So all of this really does undermine productivity, of course, in the workplace.
And Lencioni also talks about the scale of trust. So there is this thing called trust, but he talks about vulnerability based trust, which is what you've been talking about. And also the other end of that is destructive trust.
Hmm.
So the destructive trust is some of the behaviors that we've already been talking about, so the corridor conversations,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, not delivering when you've said you were going to do something. So
Hmm.
that's sort of also erodes trust. But
Hmm.
vulnerability-based trust is very different,
Hmm.
and it requires the individual to be vulnerable, to be
Hmm.
open, to
Hmm.
be able to speak their truth, and the boss to also encourage that, because you're not going to get to that space of
Hmm.
vulnerability based trust. So the leader has to be that example of
Mm.
vulnerability based trust,
Yes. Yes.
to encourage it, to nurture it within the
Yeah.
team.
It's creating a climate where people feel that they can be more open maybe than
Yeah,
they normally are,
yeah,
without it's psychological safety. Amy
exactly.
Edmondson's concept of yeah.
Exactly. I was
Mm.
just thinking that as you
Mm.
were saying it, I was thinking, yeah, this is the psychological safety that
Mm.
you and I will look to create when we're working either one on one or one with a group of people, to
Mm.
make sure that they feel safe to
Hmm.
be able to articulate what they want
Mm.
to articulate.
Yeah.
And of course, this all then speaks to, if they aren't speaking their truth, if
Mm.
I'm the leader and I'm thinking,
Mm.
okay, we're all heading in the same direction, but
Mm.
actually, if I've not been vulnerable and not been able to share where I am, even if
Mm.
I'm a couple of percent off
Mm.
compared to everyone else, over time, that's going to be a long way off.
Mm. Mm.
And
Mm.
that's why it's really important that we are all on the same page.
Yeah.
So
I mean, one of the ways we start this process through emotional intelligence is helping people sort of talk about feelings,
mm,
which again nowadays is more acceptable than it was when we started 20 odd years ago.
yeah,
So going into a boardroom of engineers and saying, right, get your shoes off. We're going to, sit on bean bags and discuss how we're feeling.
yeah,
But we did it. The way we did it actually was we'd say, well, we got a score from 0 to 9, and I want you to put yourself on which number are you? And oh, well, okay, I'm a 5, yeah,
yeah,
on sort of happiness or enthusiasm or whatever. So give them the method that they buy into, and then you can, people are happy to do this stuff.
mm,
Anyways, we use, I think we may have talked about previous one podcast, but the emotions wheel,
yes,
where
yeah,
we talked about the intensity of emotions and the valence, is it positive or negative? And it's a very simple framework, um, James Russell's framework from the 1980s, which shows the different quadrants of how our emotions come out.
yeah,
And once people get that model, they can quickly place themselves. And this is really important because feelings aren't good or bad, right or wrong. You can't say, oh no, you don't feel that way, that's not right. It's not an opinion, it's not a thought, it's not questionable. Everyone owns their own feelings. So
yeah,
as long as they are feelings, people often talk about feelings as, I feel that's wrong, that's not a feeling,
yeah.
that's a thought.
That's a
So
judgment. Yeah,
that's a judgment. Yeah. I feel upset by what you said. Yeah, okay, you can feel upset,
yeah,
that's, I now know where you're coming. But this builds a communication that is less judgmental and more, if you set it up in the right way in the group, you create openness, you create trust. And because people say, okay, what are you upset about?
yeah,
Now we're getting
yeah.
into a conversation, um, and it's a way in to
Mm,
those in a safe way.
mm. No, I like that. I like that a lot,
Mm.
especially encouraging the, okay, so it's almost like forensically trying to
Mm.
analyze, okay, so where's that come from? What's that
Mm.
about? What's the evidence
Mm.
for that?
Mm.
Give me some examples of where this has shown up and why you might be feeling that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you're getting to the issue, because then, you could, as a leader or a team member, you can then put your finger on, now I
Mm.
see
Mm.
why I've upset
Mm.
you, and
Mm.
you're having those thoughts and
Mm.
feelings, so
Mm.
yeah.
And remember, we talk about feelings beneath behaviors, beneath performance. So if
Mm,
there's a performance issue, like, you know, it could be individuals, but ultimately performance leads to, in business terms, poor productivity and poor profitability and so on. So why is it not working? Well, let's look at performance. Let's look at, but feelings are driving these behaviors.
yeah.
So if you really want to understand why the behaviors aren't meeting the needs of the business, you need to sometimes stop, slow down, and say, well, this is how people are feeling, quite honestly.
Mm,
And unless you can change this emotional climate, it's not going to get better. It's probably going to get a lot worse. Um,
yeah, yeah,
and that is often the source to then shifting behaviors, what they call culture, How do
Yeah.
we do things around here? And that will ultimately lead to changes in productivity and performance, which is what we're trying to achieve. But unless you're prepared to go back to the emotional intelligence level, often it's unresolvable. And I see it all the time in organizations creating competency frameworks as a way of controlling behaviors.
Yeah.
And all you do is spend an inordinate amount of human resource and business effort trying to control people to do things they don't want to do because they don't feel engaged,
Yeah.
motivated, loyal, whatever it is.
Or have much choice around it.
Or to the autonomy, control. There's lots of
Yeah.
emotional needs that aren't being met that
Mm.
we discussed early on. The emotional needs that people have. We need a sense of autonomy, volition, meaning,
Yeah.
empathy, control, whatever. If these things aren't being met, it's going to end up with problems in your business.
Yeah.
And it's only so long. And you see, dare I say, in the public sector, they spend their entire huge billions of pounds of money trying to resolve it at the sort of competency and control areas
Mm.
without getting beneath the cause. And trust is a very fine example of where that can, manifest.
It's the core. It's the I talk about it in. I go back to Lencioni's model. It's
Mm.
the foundation. So if you haven't got trust, you then can't have healthy conflict, which then has an impact on commitment, which then has an impact on accountability, which then
Yes.
finally has an impact on the results, as you spoke
Yeah.
about. So it is fundamentally it trumps. If you've got an issue anywhere, so if the results aren't there, then fundamentally it will always wiggle its way back down to trust.
Yeah. Trust. I'd align that to openness.
Yeah,
They're kind of very close concepts, aren't they?
yeah, yeah,
And then you kind of got awareness, because how can you be open if you're not aware?
yeah. No,
Um,
you've got to have that. So
yeah,
it's the dialogue, isn't it? So the
it is.
open, honest dialogue that
Mm,
allows trust to grow
mm,
and
mm,
thrive. Because
mm,
if trust is high,
mm.
then everything else should come as a result of it. So you should
Yes,
then be able to have healthy
yes,
conflict, not
yes,
destructive conflict. And you
yes,
should be able
yes.
to have you should be able to commit fully
Mm,
and also take personal
mm,
responsibility for
mm,
stuff instead of
mm.
blaming everybody, etc., which will
And
then lead
I'd
to better
say,
results.
yeah, and still, and coming back to yourself as well. Sort of, I think the trust thing is it's about you and me and our relationship. Yes, it is. That's how it's
Mm,
playing out. But maybe I've got my stuff going on, you've got your stuff going on, and maybe if we can both get to a little bit beneath that. So, well, I don't like being, excluded from events. You don't like it when other people try to take control of you.
yeah.
And actually, if we understand that, then we can see where there's a bit of conflict created,
Mm,
mistrust possibly, and
mm,
other things. So sometimes we need to get into our own stuff a little bit to understand how it's playing out in our relationship, and actually just being more open, listening, finding out how you're feeling as a doorway in. First of all, you listen to how I'm feeling and say, why do you feel like that? Well, I don't think you trust me, or I think you try to control me all the time, whatever. Then we can start resolving issues in a way
yeah.
that isn't saying you did this to me yesterday.
And it's interesting because actually that's one of the things I talk to individuals and also teams about is the fact that actually this stuff is easy to do. It's just
mm,
easier not to. And
mm,
what gets in the way of it's easy to do, it's just easier not to, is time.
mm,
So they don't invest the time to have the conversations. So lots of organizations struggle to set aside time for the senior team to get together and develop themselves and have
mm,
those
mm,
conversations.
mm.
So all this stuff has to. There's no way it can get better without us as a team discussing
Mm.
stuff.
Yes, yeah,
And if that time isn't in the diary because they're so busy and they're focused
mm,
on
mm,
results,
mm, yeah,
they're sort of almost on a
yeah,
treadmill, just running on a treadmill, staying in the same
yes,
space.
yeah. And we find this on workshops, getting buy-in to a day out the office, or
Yeah,
even 2 days, or let's
yeah.
go further and resolve all what's going on in this team over three.
Mm,
But it can be playing out for years and years and years, and enormous amount of cost. Never mind people resigning. And I mean, it's interesting hearing the stuff about the COVID inquiry at the moment, and Boris Johnson saying, "Well, this is all part of politics," and there's a lot of push and shoving, and yes, conflict is good as well as destructive if it's not managed properly. But this is playing out in every organization. And the emotion intelligent organization, I would describe as one that is adaptive and responsive and can have constructive conflict. And it's a difficult place to get to. But on your point of time, Jim, if you can dedicate a little bit of time to addressing this stuff and working it through, I've seen it have massive benefits in the long term. Massive, because people use this and it's hit them at a deeper level than just doing a skills workshop.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I've also seen it as well. People spring to mind that are great leaders that have done the work, with their team. So, I typically recommend at least 2 days per quarter with a leadership team so that can discuss this stuff. So that they can unpack it and have those sessions facilitated. So the CEO or the leader of that team is not trying to facilitate it. There's an outside, getting the outside help in, what was the book called?
Is it about conflict resolution? Or
Yeah, no, I think it was How the Mighty Fall. That's right.
Yeah.
How the Mighty Fall. And big organizations end up falling, and it's because of hubris, because they think they're too big and they can't fail.
Yeah.
And you need the external help in.
That complacency. I mean, my mind was wandering off to all sorts of big global issues at the moment. I was thinking about Gaza and the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I'm not by any means thinking of a way forward. Just trying to understand how this is where Myers-Briggs came in originally. After the First World War, Isabel Myers, Catherine Briggs were saying, well, why is it that nations don't get on? Why are the world wars happening? And I'm not saying this is a solution, but it's a way forward to understand human differences. And if you can recognize that people are different and they have different needs, emotional needs, and this is a bit of listening to what those are. The IRA conflict went on for decades in the United Kingdom. Eventually, it was almost resolved as it is today, largely because they were prepared to sit down, it's a simple metaphor, but get beneath the surface a bit more. And they apply a lot of these models to conflict resolution, whether it's global politics or whether it's in the boardroom. But what we're talking about here with these processes around emotional intelligence, getting into feelings that drive behavior performance, it's the same thing essentially. Because people really are people. It doesn't matter whether it's global wars or whether it's you and me having a tiff about something. It's still a human condition that's not working out, and some of this stuff can make very profound differences. Either that or it just lingers for years and years, and all too often it does. And those are the businesses that fail because they're not prepared to sort of address this type of stuff.
Yeah, and you're so bang on, Joe, in terms of which I'd expect you to be anyway. But the feelings piece is the piece that is the bit that makes the difference, and think, I like your description, and it's probably better for you to articulate it because I always probably get tongue twisted with the wording, but thinking about your feelings.
Yeah, it takes us back, doesn't it, to the original definition of emotional intelligence, which is, intelligent use of your emotion, or thinking about what's going on for you and recognizing that in other people. But it also works the other way, where you can actually intuitively sense whether a thought is the right thing, it's taking the right direction. This is getting to the micro level of what's going on for us, the self-awareness piece, if you will, and awareness of others piece. But I think, just thinking of time now, Jim, we've talked about quite a lot of really relevant stuff in terms of application and how relationship management, trust, we were going to talk about more on this podcast, but I think this has opened up all sorts of interesting topics around that theme of relationship management, simply by looking at one concept of trust and how we can get very defensive. And I think we really only picked up on mistrust here, but there's also the over trusting side, which we can pick up another time, maybe.
I mean, I'm a great example of mistrusting, so we'll be
Are you?
sort of,
I thought you were over trusting.
Oh no, sorry. Over trusting. Sorry, not mistrusting.
We'll talk about
I have
next podcast.
Very little mistrusting actually, which gets me in trouble. So I've had to grow my carefully trusting scale.
Yeah.
And actually, interestingly, you go back to the whole point of, it's about awareness. So I am aware that I'm over trusting.
Mm-hmm.
So I still maintain that that's not a bad approach to have, as long as I'm aware that I'm over trusting. So I sort of rein myself back a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And this is always the first step in EI, is it? Noticing, recognizing, being aware, and then it gives you a little bit of choice. If you can do it in the moment, say, hang on, old habits coming in. Let's just deal with this.
No, I pre-think those things. I think, okay, I know what I'm like. I know that this is my tendency, so I'll just need to sort of dampen myself down a little bit. So yeah.
Are you okay if we pause?
Yeah, I think
here,
this is it's been delightful to jump into the relationship scales. The conversation we've had today, hopefully our listeners will get some really good stuff so that they can now sort of apply. I'll add the link in, Joe, that you spoke about in terms of the paper that you wrote that mentions the unconditional regard stuff, and I'll look forward to seeing you in a week or so's time for our next episode.
Yeah, be post-Christmas, at least for us. So
yeah, no, it will be for us for sure. So great to see you today, Joe. Thank you again for your knowledge and your wisdom that you bring to this space, and have a great Christmas as well.
Yeah, I'll see you in 2024.
Whoa.
All being well.
Okay, yeah, you will.
Okay.
Okay, you, cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode. Thank you for listening. Remember to share and subscribe to the EI Guru podcast, and if you have any questions, you can post them once you've subscribed. You can follow me on Instagram at the EI Guru, and you can get more information from my website, theeiguru.com. Have a fantastic week. Bye for now.